Hi, everybody. My name is Danielle, and I am the Outreach and Volunteer Coordinator for Northwest Veg. And today we're going to be making something that I think has a reputation of being really intimidating. If you've ever watched Julia and Julia or studied any of Julia Child's cooking techniques and things like that, this is the beef bourguignon. And the movie Julia and Julia does a really good job of kind of adding to that, that anxiety that folks can have when they make this dish. Just as a quick survey, has anybody that is attending had this dish made vegan or made not vegan? And or have they ever made this dish? Oh yeah, thanks, Jacqueline. Yeah, the movie's now on Netflix. It's a super fun watch. You don't have to be a cooking enthusiast to enjoy it. And you also don't have to really be super familiar with Julia Childs to enjoy it. So I'd love to know, just drop it in the comments if anybody has made this vegan or not vegan, and then also if they've eaten it vegan or not vegan. So, because I always like to know what people's thoughts are going into it, any anxieties or trepidation that they have about it. Never made it vegan, never had it vegan, probably had it in another life not vegan. It's essentially like a country stew. And so what makes this, I think, a really enjoyable dish is it's very hearty, but it's also mostly, depending on what ingredients you choose to put in it, it can be very whole foodsy. It uses a pretty decently low amount of oil. And then it just has like so much room for complex flavors to play and for really complementing things. So it's not as complicated. It doesn't have to be. I guess that's what I would choose to say. It doesn't have to be as complicated as some folks may feel like it is. And we're really lucky because we're going to be making it with seitan and soy curls or tempeh. And so we're not going to have to be like worrying about what you might do if you were using traditional animal parts. So because of that, we're kind of given a little bit of leeway there. But like many of the other courses that we've done for the workshops here, this is pretty flexible. You have a lot of wiggle room. You have room to make this your own if you want it to have a more bold, rich flavor, if you want it to be a little fresher and lighter. That's totally up to you. So the beef bourguignon essentially is like a hearty country beef stew that has mushroom, carrot, onion, and then a wine, and then a tomato sauce. So if you kind of think of like that beef and barley flavor, but a little bit more complex and rounded out, that's what you're gonna get with this. And then it's usually paired with, you can serve it on roasted potatoes. I absolutely love it on mashed potatoes. You can also do it with rice, any kind of carb. Some people like to have it in a bread bowl or dip like a crusty slice of bread into it. So it's up to you on what you want to do with it. So I'm going to go ahead and move this over here. And there we go. Let's turn this around. There. And so that way we can go ahead and get this skillet started. And we are going to take our olive oil and we're just going to put just a couple of teaspoons of it on our cast iron skillet. Now, you don't have to have a cast iron skillet for this, but I would recommend if you know, a Dutch oven or something like that, just because what we want to do is we want to get everything nice and grilled, and all of the browning and the sauces are going to kind of really mature and caramelize in this skillet. And then we want to be able to take all those deep, rich, complex juices and then put them in the oven. So you kind of lose that if you were putting it on a skillet and then you put it in like a glass dish, but in a pinch, you can absolutely do that. So just put our couple of tablespoons of oil on the skillet. And cast iron is also really nice. I think we had talked about this in some of the other workshops. It's really good at giving you an even heat distribution. So that's one of the reasons why I always really enjoy cooking with cast iron. It's a great natural non-stick. If you take care of them, you can give it on to your great grandkids. But if you've got an oven or a stovetop that is kind of maybe burns a little high, or if you've ever put your tortilla to heat a tortilla, and you can see the rings of your burner, even though you put it on a skillet, that is an indication that your skillet's not transferring the heat evenly, right? So because your cast iron is so dense, the whole pan heats up, and then you get a really nice even distribution of heat, which is nice, because what we're doing today is we don't want to like make a grilled cheese. We're not doing something where we just want something to sear on the bottom and not be kind of enveloped in even heat, because we are going to ultimately transfer this to the oven. So, and the thing is with cast iron, though, it can take a little bit longer to heat up, but that's okay. In the meantime, we've turned on our oven to 350 degrees so that it can be heating up. And then if you are somebody who's going to be using ham or bacon, if you're somebody who likes that mixed in with the beefy flavor and texture of the seitan, you can also leave out the seitan. That's optional as well. So if you're somebody who's like, I'm here more for the bacon or the ham texture, you can absolutely do that. I would recommend, just for products, we've talked about the tofurkey ham before. I personally don't like the combination of the ham and the beef. I think it gets lost a little bit, but I know some folks really love it. So if you are somebody who's going to be putting in the optional ham, you can't go wrong with the tofurkey ham. I also absolutely love the vegan bacon slices from, I think it's called, yeah, All Vegetarian Inc. So I know that there are several places in Portland that sell this. You can also order a box of it. I think you get a minimum of 36 packs of it directly from the company if you've got a freezer or something like that. So this is hands down the best bacon that I've ever had. You can see it's got kind of like the marbling, it crisps up really well. And I cherish this bacon so much that I don't put it in soups or stews, just because if I wanted ham, I would do something a little bit more like this. This cooks up great in soups and stews and things like that. But so if you're somebody who's looking for that, those are the recommendations that I would have for you for that. So if you are doing the ham or the bacon, you're going to want to chop that up. The ham, typically, if you were doing ham, you would put it in a little bit smaller proportion than you would the seitan. So you're going to have it, you wouldn't have it be just as big and as chunky. It should be a little bit smaller. I would say like closer to a little bit around the size of the carrots that you're cutting. And then if you're going to do, you can also do tofu as well. But let me see if I can get my tempeh here. If you're going to do seitan, there's a really great company. Let me get a version of it out here too. Blackbird seitan. I found these folks out when I was in New York City a couple of years ago. And they are hands down some of the best that I've had. That's my cat Scarlett saying hello. So now you can order this on GTFO, it's vegan.com. It's the online grocery store. So that's something that you can put in. This is what I used to make traditionally. What I used to make. Let me go get my husband to get my cat. Like, yeah, same time. This is what I usually use to make it. But I'm gonna make it with tempeh today, just because I'm trying to do a couple of different alternatives. So the one that I have in the oven right now is soy curls. And then I've got smoked tempeh that we're gonna use for this round. I feel like folks are pretty familiar with seitan already. It has such a good chewy mouthfeel. It takes on the beefy flavor really well. And tempeh can do the same thing. Tempeh can take, you know, it's got a really nice hearty flavor, just in case there's folks here who are not familiar with it. You know, it's got like some good bend to it. You can see it's basically got like a nice chewy meaty texture. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut it up, and this is replacing our beef. So I want the chunks to be a little bit bigger than I would have the ham or bacon. So if I was doing the ham and bacon, I would make it this size, and I am having my beef one be this size. So I'm gonna go ahead and toss this onto the stovetop. And the point that we're doing right now is we want to brown it. We want to get like a nice crisp exterior. And the reason why we are doing that is because it's going to be sitting and stewing for a bit. And if you don't get that good crisp exterior, a lot of times, and you know, this is just a preference thing, but this kind of helps keep it from getting a little extra mushy. And as it's sitting and stewing in all of these delicious broth and juices that we are going to give it, this kind of helps give it a little bit of insulation so it doesn't get too mushy. So that's why we're kind of searing it, giving a little bit of browning. If you're doing something that's oil-free, you would do this with broth, but you are not going to get the searing and the browning. Like, it will brown, but the reaction that you're going to have is going to be like how your onions and things saute and they change color in the broth. It's not creating a crisp seal around it. So it's not going to have the same effect, but again, that's just a preference. So if you're somebody who prefers having oil-free and or just like once you've got like a hearty soup and you're putting it with your mashed potatoes or your rice, it's not going to make the end of the world if you don't have the crispest bite of tempeh or seitan. So my stove runs pretty hot. So it doesn't take, once the skillet heats up, it doesn't take too long to get everything kind of browning. And so I just try to flip everything over one at a time and keep track of which side needs turned next. And just let that cook a little bit more. So at this point, we would be chopping up our onions, our carrots, our mushrooms, and that is what we're gonna remove this tempeh as soon as it's done cooking. And I'm gonna take you over here real quick so that we can take a peek. There we go. At the, there we go. At the stuff that I've chopped up, just so we can talk about sizes and things like that. So again, this is all preference. If you're somebody who likes to have your soup a little bit smaller, bite-sized bits, you absolutely can. This is just recommended size. There's no scientific reason. I think if you diced it, you're gonna end up with more of like a curry than you're gonna have a stew, and that could be delicious too. For my carrots, the directions I put about ½ inch. This is about as big, let's see, make sure I get, there we go. This is about as big of a size difference as I would go. In fact, I would probably have halved this guy if I was paying a little bit closer attention, but we're not in rough shape here. We can see these are about the same width. So I'm not too upset with how much bigger. This guy's only a little bit bigger, but we want to make sure that everything's as uniform as possible for that. And then the mushrooms can be whatever size you want. Some folks like them really finely chopped. Some folks like them big. I don't particularly like mushrooms, so I like to keep them relatively big, just so that way it's easier for me to kind of eat around. And just as a tip, as someone who isn't really crazy about mushrooms, I always make this with the mushrooms, just because this recipe is really enhanced by the earthy, meaty flavor that you get with the mushrooms. And so if I were to leave it out, it wouldn't interact with the wine and the beef as well. And so it would end up being a little flat. So even as somebody who's not crazy about mushrooms, I always try to make sure that I put them in there. And so it all depends on the size of the skillet that you're using. And so you're probably going to end up with leftovers. And you might have noticed in the recipe as well, when it was talking about the broth, and we talked about like 2 to 3 cups of vegan beef broth. But then the instruction says like to make sure you have enough broth that's covered. So if you've got like a really deep Dutch oven, that's going to be a different amount to make sure everything is covered than if you're using a relatively shallow skillet. So again, you're just going to kind of play this by ear. You're going to want to just kind of keep an eye out and try to see what dimensions are going to work for you. And so we may have some leftovers of this. If that's the case, I want to try to make sure it's evenly distributed as possible. You don't want to end up with all mushrooms, which is what I put on top, and then find out that this isn't going to fit in my skillet. So then I'm going to have no onions or carrot in it. So the other thing that I would say is if you are in a situation where you don't have fresh mushrooms, or you also just like, you don't have the best broth, like maybe you have a weaker broth and it doesn't have that salty, deep punch that like a bouillon cube has, then if you're looking for something to kind of punch that up, then I would recommend using dried mushrooms. So this is a really great one. This is a chef's mix of mushrooms, and it adds a lot of flavor. I think it's wild mushrooms, shiitake, oyster, and chanterelle. And so it adds a lot of different flavors to whatever soups that I'm making. The downside for me is that because they are kind of more fine, it is harder for me to eat around and pick out. But the flavor boost that I get is usually worth it. So if you're somebody who's trying to compensate, you don't have the best broth on hand, or you want a deeper mushroomy flavor, I would add in the dried mushrooms. Now, you just have to make sure that you are gonna, if you're ever using those dried mushrooms, they need to be in moisture for 20 minutes. So I would never use them for a stir fry. I would never put them in like a pasta sauce unless it was like as a topping. I would slow cook that pasta sauce on a very low heat or something like that. So that way we're not just getting crunchy, dry, chewy, leathery fruit roll up, but made out of mushrooms. So I'm going to take you back over to the skillet side here. There we go. So let me grab a fork so I can show you the browning that we've got going on here. So there we go. I'm all discombobulated on where the camera is. Okay, there we go. So we've got, you can see like it's getting a nice brown on it. It is definitely getting kind of a tough exterior. Like I can tap on it. It's got kind of a shell on it. So that's browning really nicely. I'm very happy with how this is. So I can go ahead and remove it and set it aside. And then I will take, that's the trains. That Trains and Cats is the soundtrack for where I live. So I can go ahead and remove these, set them aside. We've done our browning. And if I had a liquid beef broth, instead of just a bouillon cube, and it was like a really nice concentrate, like Johnny's, if anybody has ever used Johnny's au jus sauce, you can oftentimes find that vegan at like Fred Meyer and Safeway. I might have tossed in some Johnny's with this, not the Johnny's seasoning, but the actual like au jus sauce, because I think that would have added to that like deep mouthfeel of kind of beefiness. So just checking in. Ooh, my glasses got all fogged up. Yeah, this is the stuff I just got out of the oven. Actually, let me come in higher up here and see if I can not fog up the camera. So this is the one that I made with soy curls just to have done. So I'm gonna go ahead and take it out. We don't want to overcook it because everything will be mushy. So I've got this hot skillet here, and I'm gonna go ahead and start adding in my mushrooms and my carrots. And this is not as important if you like want to use broth here. We don't need to worry about browning these as much. Vegetables don't need to have the same crispness that we usually expect for our meat. Our trick with our vegetables is we just want to make sure that we're not overcooking them, because then they are going to turn into mush. So I think I'm going to go ahead and just leave it at this amount, because once I put in the tempeh, maybe one more handful, we want to make sure that we can still stir it as well. So we don't want to have it like so packed up to the top that we can't stir it. So I'm going to go ahead and keep it at this level. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and cook this, and it says until softened. I know that your carrots up on the top here, they're not going to get softened. We're just trying to get like the juices going. We want to have everything start to begin to break down. There's a very big difference in the flavor that is released when you have vegetables on direct heat versus when you have them in more ambient heat in the oven. So we've talked about this with some of the other stuff. Like if I am cooking something with direct heat right now and I've got carrot, onion, and mushroom, I'm still they're like starting to let go of their flavors a little bit, but they're still gonna hold on to that flavor. And so I'm gonna be able to keep it a little bit crisper, control that a little bit easier. And then also each bite should still have, like when I taste the mushroom, it should taste like mushroom. When I taste the carrot, it has a higher chance of still tasting like carrot, provided I don't overcook it. If I were to put this in the oven, there would be a little bit more of a give and take. And so then your carrot's gonna kind of like give off a little bit of its carrot flavor. The onion will give off a little bit of it, and then you have a higher chance of everything kind of having that Fruit Loops effect. So that's why we're getting it started here. Because otherwise, if it's just sitting in a bath of liquid in the oven, it's gonna just all give off all of its individual flavors. It's also gonna get mushier faster. So we just wanna get things started with browning up a little bit of everything. Now, normally, if you've taken any workshops or demos with me and I talk about when we're making soups, this is when I would be seasoning my soup. So this is when I would be adding my thyme under normal circumstances. This is a little bit different just because it's kind of a pre-cooking stage since we're browning stuff and then we're putting it in the oven. I absolutely think you can add your thyme right now if you wanted to. But thyme is like, it's such a fickle spice. I usually end up liking to add it in just a little bit late. And we're going with such like we've got so many effects going on. We've got the tomato and the acid in the tomato. We've got the acid and sugar that we've got in the wine. We've got the saltiness of the beef broth. So I don't feel like it's like when you're making chicken noodle soup and you add in your thyme and stuff like that, like it's the main event, right? Because otherwise you just have salt and vegetables. The thyme that you're adding in there is adding to the flavor that tells you you're eating chicken noodle soup. In this instance, your thyme is a supporting actor. So it's really just there to make everybody else shine a little bit more. And in that instance, we don't have to season it right now, but you can if you want to. So it's either one, but if you're somebody who's wondering why we're not seasoning now, which I'm very emphatic about when we're making soups, that's why. So we can start to see a glisten happening on the onions. Let me get my fork. So we're getting this nice sheen and glisten on the onions. And there we go. So that's kind of telling me that it's releasing some of its juices. It's getting nice and cooked. It doesn't have to be soft. In fact, I don't want to be able to quickly and easily pierce this carrot. It's barely punched through. That's a pretty good state. If I can go ahead and just like chop right through, I've overcooked these. And now it's gonna be more of like a gravy. So we want everything to be like nice and firm because it's gonna go sit in the oven for 30 minutes. So this is almost done. So I'm gonna go ahead and add the garlic. Now in this, you can use my standard go-to that I am always using, my dried garlic. You can absolutely use that. Soups always do great with this. But since we are going and sauteing it and I've got this garlic that I need to use up, I'm gonna go ahead and use a little bit of pureed garlic. Garlic is, again, one of those things that's a taste. If you're someone who's always like, there's never enough garlic, you don't have to be limited to what the recipe says. You can always add in a little bit more. Now, because if I was using the dried garlic, I would use a lot less because it packs a punch. A little bit goes a long way. When you're using pureed garlic or any kind of pre-cut garlic, like the big jars of like minced garlic that you can buy, it loses a lot of its garlic punch and flavor in the processing and in the preservatives that they add to it. So you might need to add a little bit more. So that's just something that you're gonna wanna play around with. So I love garlic, so I'm finishing off this jar. And then you just cook for an additional 30 seconds, maybe 60 seconds. Doesn't need to be too long. And one of the reasons why we added the garlic in at the end, and we've covered this in some of the other workshops, is because garlic gets bitter really fast. The sulfates that are in garlic are not unlike the ones that are in the onion, but they're much more heat sensitive. And so they get bitter and like have a bad, like it almost is in the back of your throat, a bad taste. So we don't want to cook it forever. It also just burns fast too. It doesn't sweat as much as everything else. You know, like if you were to squeeze a slice of onion, you could feel some of those water cells in there. Garlic does not have as much of those water cells to spare. So it just burns faster. So we're at a perfect time now. I'm gonna go ahead and add in the tempeh. And again, just wanna keep it stirring. We wanna make sure that we don't have something that's been sitting on the bottom of the skillet the entire time and some other big crunchy carrot that's been sitting on top. So in this moment, then we've added in, if you have the bacon or the ham, this is when we would add that in as well. And then we're gonna go ahead and add in our butter. And so what we're kind of doing with this situation is we are creating kind of a roux. So we're giving a thickening agent. So the butter, what we're gonna do is we're gonna coat everything with the butter. Now, if you used a lot of olive oil earlier and you still can see that you have olive oil, like don't add butter. We don't want this to be an over oily dish. If you were really light on the oil before, or you didn't use oil, you can use coconut oil. You can do this without oil, but it's gonna be a little tougher because what we're doing is we're actually coating everything with this butter. And then we're gonna add the flour, and the flour is then going to evenly coat on everything. And then when we add in our liquids, that stuff is gonna kind of like have this like sweating out of the flour and the oil, and it should evenly create a thicker situation. If you don't want that, or if that's not something that's available to you, that's what the flaxseed can really help kind of thicken things up as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and add in my flour. And if you are somebody who you are gluten-free, and maybe that's why you're using tempeh, rice flour works great in almost any time that you're thickening something. I'm using Bob's Red Mill 1-to-1 flour. Either one is fine. I wouldn't say that like chickpea flour would be my favorite because it can get a little gummy. And I would use white rice flour instead of brown rice flour because white rice is so much more finer grain like brown rice flour can be sandy. So you can see, like I said, everything's getting nice and coated. And so we don't want to just like overcook this. This is just to make sure that we've evenly distributed. I don't want to see any big blobs of flour. This is starting to look really good. So now we're going to go ahead and add our wine. And we're going to add our vegan beef broth. Now, we talked about this in the sauce series about what kind of wine to use. So I actually ran to the store the other day to buy wine for this, and they only had a Cabernet Sauvignon, which wasn't something that I was really wanting, because the tannins in that Cab Sauvignon can get bitter fast. So that was something that I was just thought, no. And we also don't want something that's too fruity, right? Like you don't want something that's gonna have like a minced cherry flavors or anything like that, because you don't want your delicious savory dish to taste like blueberry jam. Rules of thumb, if you can make most wines work. If stick with a blend if you can, because a blend is gonna make it so that you've got at least some of the right grapes. And then also don't do anything oak aged. So if you have something that says like, oh, hints of oak, or has been aged in barrels for X amount of time, then that's gonna be a situation where that's gonna come out while we're doing this slow cooking process. Oh, I see Dana has raised a hand. Is that old? Dana, do you have a question? I'll go back to the chat. You can type it in the chat if you've got a question. Okay, that's all. So you don't want that to come out to have an oaky flavor. So if you've got a blend, cheap is great. You don't want something that is super fancy for this, because we're really just here for the sugars, a little bit of the sulfates, the tannins. And so we don't need to pay for something. I think the bottle of wine that I got was like a $6 bottle of wine. I went with Merlot. So yeah, I would just say like, go with something that doesn't break the bank, doesn't have oak aged, and also isn't like the other kind that they had was Moscato, and it was like super, super light and fruity and fun. So the beef broth that I'm using today is the Edward & Sons Not Beef. It's not my #1 favorite beef broth, but it is very accessible, so I do end up using it quite a bit. So this is also when we're gonna put in our dried herbs, so which is our thyme. So we're gonna use 1 teaspoon of thyme. And then the other dried herb that we're using is our bay leaf. There we go. So for folks who are not super familiar with making soups, I want to talk a little bit about the bay leaf, just because it took me a while to get a deeper understanding of them. So the bay leaf is almost always like, you're almost never going to see them fresh. They're always dry and brittle. For me, I started to feel like I could never even taste that I had put in a bay leaf. And so I started to feel like, why am I putting it in? I can't even tell the difference. So I put in another one. And I would think, what difference can it make? I have this big pot of soup. Literally, I might have a gallon of soup. And so like, how much is it going to make a difference if I add in another bay leaf? And it does make an intense difference. So if you use too much bay leaf, the way I would describe bay leaf it's kind of a musky, or like an Old Spice smell. It ends up tasting like you kind of like peeled off some Old Spice cologne or something and put it in your soup, which of course is a very strong and bad flavor. And we don't want that complementing our wine, our tempeh, our onion, our mushroom. So one is all it needs, just like a nice cologne. It shouldn't be the main event. It shouldn't be the first thing someone notices. It should be in the background and it should be complementing everything else. So definitely go light on the bay. When I was making my smaller one, I ended up like using a smaller bay leaf for cutting one in half because I didn't want to have too much bay leaf in that. So then we're also going to add in the tomato sauce, or I'm sorry, the tomato paste, which is 1 to 2 tablespoons. And again, this is depending on how bold and rich of a sauce you like. And you can always add in more. This is not something, it needs to be present right now so that way everything can kind of get working with the sugars in the wine and stuff like that. But if you need to add more, you can. So we just want to go ahead and stir all of this up, and we want to bring it to a simmer. And we want to make sure that the bay leaf is submerged, especially when we put it into the oven. Because if it's not submerged when we put it in the oven, it's just going to dry up like a crisp, and you are not going to be able to taste all of the wonderful things that it's doing to accent everything else. So we bring this to a simmer, and you can see like it's kind of getting thicker already because of the flour that we've put in. If I wanted to thicken it up a little bit more, which I actually think I will for this guy, that's when I would add in my flaxseed. And so I use Bob's Red Mill whole ground flaxseed. And I would add in for a pan this size, which is like a medium skillet, I would add in 2 teaspoons to start. You don't want to go crazy and add in too much because you're going to end up with an instant gravy. And you're going to be sad because nobody is really looking for a beef onion chunky pudding, which is what kind of the consistency. So I'm going to stir that in. And then at this point, if I felt like I had used too few vegetables, you could add mushrooms and you could add onion. I would not add carrot, just because that carrot can take a little while to cook and it's not going to be on even footing as everybody else. The onion and the mushroom will soften up so quickly. But you don't want to have this like beautiful velvety, perfectly balanced texture, and then have a crunch of like half uncooked carrot. Also, somebody was asking when I was talking about this recipe to someone else, like, why do I pick why are the vegetables that are in here? Can they put in something else? We talked about it in the soup series that we did, but I would not put in broccoli because that's going to make everything taste like broccoli. The same with peas. You could put cauliflower in here. Cauliflower has a much more mild thing. I would not put cabbage, same reason. I have put kale in this before, and that's fine. You can do like a nice shredded chopped up kale if you wanted to add in some roughage with that. I've had some people put in kohlrabi, and that's been pretty good because that's kind of like a nice root vegetable. So at this point, I'm going to check and make sure, yep, my carrots still can't puncture them, right? Like they're still pretty firm, which is great because again, I don't want these to overcook. I've brought this to a simmer. I'm going to go ahead and turn this off, and I'm going to go ahead and put this in the oven. And again, take care to make sure that you've kind of tucked that bay leaf underneath. We really, really want to make sure that the bay leaf is doing its job underneath. So we're going to go ahead, put this into the oven on the lower rack, 375. And while that is cooking, I want to show you a couple of things. One, let's see, I'm going to put this in a glass bowl so everybody can see it. So I'll go ahead and put what I got out of the oven, which we've also talked about in the sauce series, how important it is for stuff to set. This was pretty brothy when it came out of the oven. And now you can see like everything has soaked it up. And so now this is actually pretty light on the broth. which isn't the worst thing. I can add in a little bit more. If I was gonna add it in, I think I would put in maybe like a 1/4 cup of broth, and then I would maybe put in a teaspoon of tomato paste and whisk that together and add it in. Maybe depending on if the vegetables are really cooked too much or anything like that, if it feels like it can handle it, toss it back in the oven for 5 minutes. But this just goes to show the difference of like letting things set. So I'll go ahead and put this into a glass bowl. So that way we can kind of get a look at it. And you can see my bay leaf is floating around there. Obviously we don't eat the bay leaf, so we can go ahead and remove that, put that in compost. It's done its job. It's always polite etiquette to remove the bay leaf so no one has to accidentally worry about eating a tough, leathery, inedible leaf hidden, tucked away in your soup. And again, we can see like this had no flaxseed in it. So the flour did a really great job of kind of thickening everything up. And this is also the time I took out my skillet and tested it a couple of times while it was in the oven because I wanted to taste it and see how we're doing with that. So I'm gonna try one of these carrots. I'll show you a fork piercing test. Let's see here. So I wanna make sure, yeah, my carrot, I was able to punch through it. So I wouldn't put this back in the oven. I think that if I put this back in the oven for 5 minutes, it would be too much for this. So I would just add in a little bit of broth, maybe some flaxseed if it gets a little too loosey. I also feel like just from tasting the flavor, it's pretty good. It's got the complexity, like it's more than just beef broth. That's what we're looking for. If you're looking for a non-alcoholic variation, if you're somebody who you can't find a vegan wine, you don't have wine in the house, you don't want to use wine, there are a couple of things that you can use to work with that. You can use a red wine vinegar, but I would use a lot less of it. I would use maybe only a tablespoon because that's going to have all of the sourness and none of that sugar. You can also use a nice balsamic vinegar. So you could do like, for the cup of wine that you're supposed to use, you could do like a cup of water and then 2 tablespoons of a balsamic vinegar, which has a lot of sugar in it, especially if you were to use a balsamic glaze, which has even more sugar in it. And there are some really good like red wine balsamic vinegars and things like that that you could use. You could also use pomegranate juice if you had to. Again, like that's obviously going to be fruity. So I would use less of it and I would up the saltiness of the beef broth so that it can kind of like overpower that. But we do want that sweetness that's going to complement the tomato as well. So if you didn't have wine, I would say try to use something that you can add in a little bit of that tart sweetness. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with a beef stew, which is fine. There are worse things to end up with. But if you're looking for something that's going to take this into a different direction than just the kind of like tomatoey beef broth soup that we've had before, I'm going to go ahead and put this on here so folks can see it. Then I would absolutely recommend pomegranate juice, balsamic vinegar. If you're in an absolute pinch, red wine vinegar with a little bit of water and a little bit of sugar mixed in, that's going to help you out. If you don't have tomato paste, you can also use ketchup in a pinch. Ketchup's going to be quite sweet, so it's going to be a little bit sweeter than just the tomato paste, but one of the #1 ingredients in ketchup is tomato paste, so you'd be able to kind of get some play with that. I would not use tomato sauce. Tomato sauce is not as sweet, it's not as concentrate, so the sugars aren't there, so you're going to end up with like, it's going to have more of a bitter acidy bit, so it would taste more like some kind of tomato soup and beef stuff. So I would use ketchup if you don't have tomato paste on hand. And I think those are the main replacements. If I've had a couple people ask if you can make this with tofu, you absolutely can. I would use a pressed tofu, not like a medium or silken obviously or anything like that, but one that's like a very meaty tofu. So I'm gonna bring this up again, just so we can take a look at it and see. So this again, this is gonna be great with a beef. Actually, let's move this over here. With like a mashed potatoes, or rice, dipping a bread into, anything like that. And we can also see that this is soy curls. So the soy curls worked out really well. They kind of just really, and I did saute these and got them pretty crisp beforehand. I think something that I would experiment with in the future is I would experiment with not hydrating them, because I did add these to the, water and hydrate them first. And so I think, and the next time I do it, I might just try putting them in, because they are going to be cooking for 20 minutes. So they might not even need that. But in my history, when I've just put soy curls into a soup without browning them first, they do just get kind of mushy. So that's why I wanted to try out browning them. So the texture seems to be pretty good so far. The last thing I wanted to show everybody is I did take out, when I first, right when we were starting this, and I said, just as a check-in, this is the one that I've made before. So I put this into a little jar so we can see. This was how loose the broth was. It was actually significantly looser when I got it out. It was boiling. And again, this just shows, one, the importance of letting things set, because look at how thick it is now. It's almost like a thin gravy. And so I think that this would be just fine. It looked a little watery at the time, but similar to wine, we just want to see, does this thing have legs, right? Like when I tip it up this way and I come back, like, do I see it kind of sludging back down? And it does. And so this, if I shake it, does it slosh left and right, or does it kind of stay where it is? So this, if you do a test and you let this sit out for 5 minutes and then it has this kind of consistency, I would say your sauce is done. I'm gonna do a real quick peek at what we've got going on in the oven to see if we've got anything to report on. I'll bring it up here so that we can look at it. And I'll move this back here. So we can see that it's got kind of a skin forming on it. Put my light here, which is fine. Nothing wrong with that. Let's see how thick everything is. Yeah, this is really thickening up nicely. This just needs like another 20 minutes in the oven, and then it's gonna have this like really nice hearty, yeah, see how, oh, let me bring that up over here. So like when I bring up the spoon, it's just like drips off very slowly. So I'm very happy with seeing like how thick it is already. It still has like a nice slow drip. So this just needs about another 20 minutes in the oven and we are gonna be good to go. So if you're looking for something that kind of wows people, because it's not often made, people have it in their head that it's very intensive, it's very intimidating to make. I think this is a great meal, especially if you're looking, if you probably have most of these ingredients in your house already, which is really nice on a snow day because the grocery stores are going to be packed. It's going to be a pain to get there. So this is something that you can make. It's romantic. It's mostly whole foodsy. And then the person who didn't make it, it may end up being like, oh my goodness, like Julia Childs, oh my gosh. And really, it's just a hearty country stew that has a lot of fun, complex flavors that blend together to make a really impressive and delicious soup that is an excuse to eat with whatever carb of your choice. So does anybody have any questions or any other modifications that they wanted to ask about? If anybody has any questions, you can absolutely message me, shoot me an email at Danielle. My name, D-A-N-I-E-L-L-E. Oh, what was the brand of bacon that I held up? Did I cover that already? Just in case somebody was asking about that, it was all vegetarian ink. Yeah, and it's called Vegan Basic Slices. So, yeah. So if anybody has any questions, you can email me at danielle@northwestveg.org. Thanks for being here. Happy Valentine's Day. Stay safe and stay warm.